I represent you in the lower chamber of the state legislature. So there are 150 of us, and we do have a majority party, which is the Democratic side, and there's about 103 of us, so that's the blue dots, and I represent 14 towns and cities that you see in this map. If you count all of the local governments, including the county, that's about 21 local governments. So I'm going to start with the background of our energy landscape so that we understand why we are trying to do this legislation, which if you just walked in and have no idea what it's about, it is to replace Central Hudson with a publicly owned not-for-profit corporation. So first things first, I wish I could take credit for coming up with this idea, but it is a very old debate. Who should own our energy infrastructure? And people have been arguing about this basically since the advent of energy for mass consumption. So as an example, we have a quote here from Tom Johnson, who was one of the public power advocates back in the day, turn of the century. When he was running for Cleveland mayor in 1901, he said, "I believe in the municipal ownership of these monopolies because if you do not own them, they in turn will own you." And at this time, the common trend was to own them at the municipal level. Okay. Did I miss a slide? No. So, Central Hudson is a delivery utility. Central Hudson is not selling you energy that it built itself. Its business is getting the energy from the grid to your homes. So there are three aspects to our energy sector. The first is generation, right? It has to be built. Then whatever's been built has to be connected to the grid, broadly speaking. And once it's connected, then it has to go to the end user. So the buildings like this one, for example. So when you see a bill and it says supply charges, delivery charges, we are talking about the delivery charge when we're talking about Central Hudson. They don't control the supply side of things, which is coming from a wholesale market. The supply side is deregulated. So why are these energy delivery utilities allowed to be monopolies? In New York State, the big utilities that serve customers, there are 7 of them, and we have an exception on Long Island, which is a public-private partnership, but the rest are all corporate monopolies. And we also have smaller co-ops and municipally owned energy companies as well. But largely speaking, the trend is to have a corporate monopoly serve this energy. So people come to us and say, well, why not just add competition, right? That's the problem. The reason that they are allowed to be monopolies is they are what is considered to be a natural monopoly, and that's a sector where the fixed cost of operation is so high that if multiple companies were having to pay for the same fixed cost and split up the customer base, we're actually talking about higher rates most likely and not lower rates. So there has always been a consensus that energy delivery, because the delivery infrastructure is so costly and very cumbersome, that they are a monopoly. Like if you imagine the same street having electricity poles from 3 different companies or 3 different gas pipelines running, that would not make sense, right? So there's also a logistical reason why they're allowed to be a monopoly. So who owns Central Hudson? It has become very common now that energy utilities are owned by parent companies that are financial holding companies. So in this case, it's Fortis, which is a Canadian financial holding company that owns 12 energy companies across the world. They own only Central Hudson in New York, but these are just investment assets for parent companies like this, and they own our utility, which is Central Hudson Gas and Electric Corporation. So when a company like Fortis owns our energy utility, what that means is that investors are owners of this company. So that's why we call it an investor-owned utility. if we look at how Central Hudson is funded, 48% of its funding comes through equity, so that's shareholder investments, and the rest comes from issuing long-term debt, which is a common way that corporations of this scale, finance themselves. Now, if you look at the bottom, the revenues from bills, that's the bills that all of the customers pay, those bills collectively have to be high enough to cover 100% of the operating costs, 100% of the capital costs, 100% of the financing costs, all of the taxes we pay, and then we got to make sure that our bills are also covering the profits that are owed to the shareholders that invest in this company. Now, just a note here, when you finance, what are we talking about when we say financing costs? For example, interest rates on the loans, we pay for that as well. So we are responsible for the full running of this utility, the bills we pay. So when Central Hudson asks for a rate increase, what they usually ask for is an increase in their revenue requirement. So that's, all of the money that they need to be able to collect from the bills. So I got into office 2023, and we started intervening in the rate case that Central Hudson had just filed for. So when they ask for a rate increase, it's a legal case that happens. So they requested an increase in revenues of $181 million. And what was approved was roughly half, which is $79.3 million. And this is the trend, right? Companies will ask for X, and they expect to get more or less 50% of that amount. So what happened that year was it did not go into a settlement negotiation, which is very common. So that's why the rates were increased only for 1 year. And that's why Central Hudson filed immediately for the next year, because every year they have a need for increased revenues. So they filed again for another increase. They asked for $62.5 million for the next year. But this one went into settlement negotiations, which is basically closed-door conversation between all of the parties involved, including Central Hudson and everybody intervening in the case. And what was approved was $143.7 million over the next 3 years, which is roughly $47.9 million per year. Again, you ask for something and you expect to get a little bit of what you asked for. So when we intervened in this rate case, one of the things that we really argued against was increasing how much profits can be authorized for the shareholders. And this is what the Department of Public Service said at the meeting where they approved these rates. The rates must balance, quote, affordability concerns against utility shareholders' constitutional right to earn a reasonable return on investment. So if you're wondering what we're trying to do, is, in this case, we want to get rid of the shareholders. That's what we're trying to do. If they have this constitutional right, the only way to get rid of it is to get rid of the shareholders. So we want to change the ownership model, and that's what this bill is about. We're going to get to keep your thought, but we're going to get to Q&A. Okay. So the reason the financing model is what we see as the main problem is because this formula is how these investor-owned utilities have profits authorized. Now, the thing is actually that it's not that Central Hudson is an exceptional, greedy, or bad company. That is actually not the case. They're just an average utility. The problem is the entire model of investor ownership in this sector to begin with. So it's literally every utility that has the same problem. So how is the profit calculated? You have investments in your capital infrastructure, so that's all of the energy infrastructure, right? Like the gas pipes, the poles, the substations, and so on. then the part of that was invested in by the shareholders, so this is why you apply the equity ratio, in this case it's 48%, every dollar of that capital asset value authorizes a profit that is based on the return on equity rate, which is the ROE. So what this formula shows is that utilities are always trying to do two things to increase their profits. One, they can increase the value of their capital infrastructure, and you'll see how pervasive this is actually and how counterintuitive. The other thing they try to do is ask for a higher return on equity rate to be authorized. So for example, for Central Hudson, it's around 9.5%, but for Con Edison, it's 10% or more, right? And they always request to increase this ROE as well. So we argued that actually it should be decreased to 9%, because when we showed them all of this data to say actually even 9% is too high, Central Hudson came back and said, well, anything below 9% would be junk investment. Nobody would invest in us. So we said, okay, then let's do 9%. And that's why the Department of Public Service said, well, right? So we're going to get into that a little bit more. But this is what they said when we said, do it 9%. Contrary to Assembly members' arguments, that's me, it would not be appropriate to consider any comparison of publicly owned utilities in setting the returns of investor-owned utilities, because publicly owned utilities do not share the same risks of operations, and they have access to funding that is unavailable to investor-owned utilities. So we said, thank you. Thank you for proving our point. Now we have a good quote to put in our presentation so that people will get what we're talking about. They are saying here, you can't really compare the two because it's not fair. The publicly owned utilities just has way less things to worry about, right? And that is why we want to make it publicly owned. So remember the formula, right? The perverse incentive phenomenon that happens in the entire sector is these utilities choose to invest in things that are unnecessarily capital intensive because that's how they can increase the profits. For example, you might have two options to increase how much electricity you can flow through your grid. One option costs $60 million. The other option costs $20 million. They usually prefer the $60 million option. And if you think I'm making this up, first of all, there's lots of reports, right? And if you picked up our newsletter, there is a link that we cite, a PDF report that you can read in full if you want to get into that, of this industry-wide phenomenon of investing in unnecessarily capital-intensive methods to jack up the profits. And when we did our town hall in Woodstock, one of the people who came was like, excuse me, I used to work at a company that was hired to juice up rate increase requests by utilities. So I was like, are you confirming that this happens? And he was like, absolutely, right? So this is at the root of why we are worried about the rates not only going up this year, but in perpetuity. That's what we're trying to stop. So the report that I mentioned, it's put out by American Economic Liberties Project. This report came out January 2025, and the reason this report came out is because this is happening all over the country. These guys probably don't even know Central Hudson exists. They are talking about the entire industry. So they describe it as financial alchemy. That's the financing model. Every dollar of shareholder capital they invest turns into roughly $2 in their stock market value, a powerful incentive to invest as much as possible. So our bill, to get rid of that formula, to get rid of investor ownership, and to get rid of the perverse incentive, is the Hudson Valley Power Authority Act. So what we are proposing is to replace Central Hudson with a state-owned independent corporation that is not for profit. So we're going to talk about this model a little bit because as soon as people hear the word government, people get scared because the government has earned a lot of negative reputation, often rightly so. But we are here to talk about what it is not and what it is. So what is the Hudson Valley Power Authority? It's a financially independent, state-owned, not-for-profit corporation. So example of this already exists, which is the New York Power Authority, for example. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. So what that means is what it's not. It is not a taxpayer-funded state agency that depends on the state budget. So when people think about government run, they think about state agencies, for example, Department of Labor. That is not the model that we are using. So the model of state authorities, the state-owned corporations, really came up during FDR's time. Yes, when he was New York's governor, but also when he became the president, because there were all these needs for the government to do big things without the red tape of the government budgets, bureaucracy, and so on, and without having the taxpayers pay for those things. So that's the model that came up during that time, really in the early 1930s, which is an independent corporation that is owned by the government but is not run by the government. So what we have designed it to be, and it all depends on how you write the bill. You can write a bill to create a very bad state authority. You can do that. But you can also write a bill to do the opposite. So that's what we've done. So we have put in provisions in statute in our bill that would make it a cutting-edge utility that embraces new technologies and experts, because we do not want it to be a slow-moving bureaucratic agency run by politicians and other people who don't know what they're doing. Right? We do not want that. We want it to be a thriving, revenue-funded utility. As a rule, as a trend, when energy utilities are publicly owned, they are not subsidized by taxpayer money, which is very different from transit authorities. Transit authorities are historically subsidized to keep the rates low. In the case of energy utilities, it is all revenue funded because it's a guaranteed customer base. Everybody needs energy, and the bills people pay just keeps the whole thing running. It just keeps it running at a cheaper price compared to investor-owned utilities, because we are going to be taking advantage of all of the savings that comes up with it, which is what I'm going to get into next. So we do not want this. It is not going to be an underfunded state agency that has to beg the state for money year after year, right? That is not what we're talking about. We also have designed it to be accountable to the public with ongoing community oversight, because we do not want an opaque agency where nobody really knows what's happening. A lot of these do exist. Even lawmakers, we pass the budget and we don't know sometimes what happened to that money. Did it work? You know, what we were trying to solve? So there is a lot of, issues of accountability that we want to achieve with our bill. The other thing is, in New York, if you're a delivery for-profit company, you cannot really be in the business of generating and building energy. You can do small projects, but you can't really be the main generator of energy. But when you're publicly owned, you can be what's called a vertically integrated utility, so you can do it all. And this is, for a public corporation, a much better model and a huge advantage, which you'll see.
So you're going to replace NYSEG?
Well, until Con Edison, people take over Con Edison, NYSEG will exist, but we necessarily wouldn't have to rely on it. Okay, so the outcome, the goals that we have written this bill for, first things first, lower rates, right? Now, I just want to caveat one thing, because our critiques will say, you are selling, a dream that is not possible, which is like, free energy and forever frozen rates. And I just want to make it clear that is not what we're talking about. We're talking about lower. Okay, the ER is the space that this is operating in. So how do we know that publicly owned utilities have lower rates? Because there are many that exist in the country, and that is what the data shows. This is from the same report, if you want to read the full thing. Over the last 3 years, residential electricity rates for privately owned utilities have increased by 49% more than inflation, whereas those for publicly owned utilities have increased by 44% less than inflation. So that's what we're talking about, lower. So where do these savings come from? Well, first is elimination of profits, right? That's the most straightforward one. But if you want to go home and think about it more, what is actually critical is the elimination of the perverse incentive. Because a perverse incentive is not a static thing. It is a decision-making framework that forever favors higher spending on capital projects and lower spending on efficiencies. So you also see at the bottom investments in efficiencies. For example, there are technologies available to make it so that you have a dynamic control of how much energy can flow through the wire depending on the conditions of weather and so on. Because what happens is if you have a wire that's just for a specific temperature, it's designed to be that way because if it's too hot, it may sag and so on, right? But there are newer technologies where the wire can make a smarter decision. Do we implement this? No. We don't, but this is an example of an efficiency that could be implemented that does not make any profits. Of course, public benefit corporations are not subject to federal or state taxes. And, some people have said, well, you're saying that we'll save money in federal, state, or state taxes, but we'll just pay that money somehow else. And that is not true, because first, if you look at the state budget, this is a drop in the bucket, but do you know how much corporate giveaways we spend money on? So if we are trying to save money that is being lost in terms of taxes paid by entities, we should really be looking at the corporate subsidies and not a utility that is designed for public service. So we pay the federal and state taxes. Right now, Central Hudson does not, right? It's coming out of our pocket, but when you're a state authority, we don't have to. We do want the utility to pay local taxes, which is the property taxes, because those fund, Medicaid, school districts, and so on, so we don't want that to go away, and that's a common trend in publicly owned utilities, is that they do pay local payments. The next thing is, as a state-owned corporation, you have access to lower cost financing, including lower interest rates. If the state is your client, it is a very reliable client, right? It's not a client that it's not going to be, when you issue bonds and so on, it's not going to be high-risk bonds, which gives it the ability to just access debt financing at a lower cost. And again, we are the ones who pay the interest rates and all of the financing costs, so it means savings for us. Then I mentioned ability to generate energy, which is potential for more revenue. So on the generation side, you can, for example, Ulster County owns 2 brownfields that it wants to turn into energy generation sites for renewables, but these projects are on hold because it's too expensive to connect to the grid. The interconnection costs are too high. But Hudson Valley Power Authority could say, well, let's do it together, right? We'll co-own these projects and we'll get it connected to the grid. But also, it could invest in other generation projects to sell to NYSO. Somebody mentioned NYSO here, which is the wholesale market, and gather, additional revenues for the corporation. Also, New York Power Authority, I'm going to tell you more about this, but they have a limited amount of cheap and clean local energy. And if you're publicly owned, you are much more, you are allowed to request priority access to some of their renewables, and there's more to that I'm going to explain as well. But Central Hudson, if Central Hudson asks NYPA, hey, can we be in the queue for some of your cheap and clean energy, they're going to be like, no. Right? You're just a corporation. That's not going to happen. But NYPA does provide priority access to municipally owned utilities right now, as well as some public buildings and so on. So I've been talking about New York Power Authority a lot, and that's because it is the country's largest publicly owned energy provider. It was created through the New York State legislature, just the way we are trying to do right now, when FDR was the governor. And the reason for creating this back then was because there was this question of who would own the state's new emerging hydropower. And the people who wanted to own that was Wall Street investors. It was people like JP Morgan. So at the time, FDR and the New York State legislature really felt that this is power that should be owned by the state. So when that power went online, first of all, rates lowered immediately. And today, New York Power Authority manages and owns the state's hydropowers, which is some of the cheapest electricity in the continent. They also own and operate a significant portion of the state's transmission lines. A third of the high voltage lines is owned and operated by them. And, I'm just putting it there because sometimes people will think, well, do you think a public corporation can really do this complicated stuff? And the answer is, they already are. Lots of corporations are already doing it. Finally, financially independent and lucrative. NYPA is not held back by how much money it has. In fact, every now and then it temporarily loans money to the state budget because it is financially healthy. And we passed a bill in 2023, called the Build Public Renewables Act, that gives New York Power Authority the authorization to build new renewable energy that lowers the cost in the wholesale market and also funds automatic bill discounts for some of the neediest households. Now, before we passed this bill, NYPA was not allowed to build new energy because the private sector said, well, that's not fair to us. NYPA just has too many advantages. They will be too good at it. But that is exactly why we wanted to give them this authority, and they just have announced a plan in their first build to build about 7 gigawatts of renewable energy. We want them to build more, but this is a parallel campaign that is happening on the supply side. So the other thing to look at is proof that when you have a state-owned corporation, it can be financially a very viable entity. So on the left is Central Hudson's bond rating, which determines, how easily you can access financing. And theirs is BBB, which is pretty common for utilities, but because of the billing fiasco, it was also recently downgraded. If you look at NYPA, it has one of the highest bond ratings, 5 levels higher than Central Hudson's, and actually I think it just went up even more. So this is just to show that just because we're talking about a state-owned corporation doesn't mean we're talking about something that is completely fallen apart. Right? It can be a successful operation. Similarly, if you compare long-term debt that Central Hudson issued in 2023, the interest rate on that was 6.17%. We pay that interest rate. If you compare that to a similar long-term debt NYPA took out in 2022, the interest rate is almost half. So when we're talking about lower cost financing, this is what we're talking about. I'm not saying that Hudson Valley Power Authority is guaranteed to be the same as NYPA. I'm just saying that it's possible when you don't have to report back to shareholders. So this is purely for illustrative purpose. When people hear us say we're going to save money, usually they think we're talking about saving money at the point of acquisition. So that's the first point in the graph. That is not what we're talking about. We are talking about saving money in the projected disparity in how much the rates could be if we keep it investor-owned versus if we got rid of investor owners. So in this example, which is purely hypothetical, if Central Hudson's rate went up by 6% every year, and I'm using 6% because that's roughly been how much it's gone up by in the last few rate cases, if that went up, that's the blue line, right? If we buy Central Hudson, so this is the alternate universe, and it dips a little bit at acquisition and then it stays flat, what you see is a cone of savings that's actually growing. So we're not talking about a static saving, we're talking about savings to be captured on the day-to-day operations. Similarly, if we say Central Hudson's increases by 6%, and Hudson Valley Power Authority dips in the beginning but increases by 2% every year, you're still seeing a different version of that cone. And you can imagine, depending on what's happening in the economy, other factors, what possible shapes of the cone could exist in the future, right? But this is just to say that we are concerned not just about today's rates, we are concerned about the trajectory. So the other thing we want to have that we don't have right now is a 21st century grid. And we are not trying to make Central Hudson publicly owned because that is a goal in itself. We are trying to make it publicly owned so that we can do all these other things. So the public ownership is actually a means. It's not the end in itself. And one of those is to give ourselves a 21st century modern grid. What does that mean? Central Hudson has a lot of aging infrastructure. In fact, if you look at some of the recent rate cases, a significant portion was to replace aging infrastructure. Do they have to replace it? Of course. Do we need to do it in a way where the costs are as high as possible? No. We should be doing it at a cost that is as low as possible, and that's what would determine how quickly we can replace aging infrastructure. As an example, compared to other investor-owned utilities in the state, Central Hudson has power lines that share the same age, so they are all around the same age. So when they need to be replaced, they all are going to be needed to be replaced at the same time, which means there's going to be a cost that is going to peak at one point in time rather than being spread out. It also costs a lot of money to replace leak-prone gas pipes. It is extremely expensive, but it would be cheaper because, of course, we have to replace leak-prone pipes. It would be cheaper if we change that ownership and financing model. Efficiencies we talked about. There are ways to do more with less if we actually implement technologies that are efficient, which are not done right now because they don't really make a lot of money. Resiliency. So, because of the cost attached to anything that is to do with the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure, some things become cost prohibitive. One example is, burying power lines wherever possible. PSC did a report, and they basically said it would be so expensive that it would not be worth the benefits. But if we got rid of the model where every spend on capital project also authorizes profits, if we get rid of the state and federal taxes, if we get rid of the high interest rates, it could become possible to do some of these things that may not make profits, but that increase the reliability of the service and the quality of the service and so on. Another example is strengthening transmission lines. Now, Central Hudson already does this, but if it costs cheaper, we could do it faster and we could do more of it and so on. Tree trimmings. We think that more tree trimmings could be done as a matter of regular maintenance. I live on a fairly rural street where I drive every day past trees that are literally dangling on the wires, but it's cheaper to just have the power go out and come fix it rather than go around proactively doing tree trimmings. But if you don't have shareholders to respond to, if you're only accountable to the public, you're going to want to trim some trees. And finally, I gave the example of the interconnection. There is a lot of new renewable energy projects that are not able to go live because it is too expensive to connect to the grid. The grid is basically not ready for what we need it to do, and that is a statewide trend. But if we get rid of that profit motive, the benefit of a public authority, and this also applies to New York Power Authority, is you can absorb upfront costs and not have to worry about how this is going to look in your quarterly reports, how this is going to terrify or not terrify your shareholders. For example, Hudson Valley Power Authority could say, we're going to connect those two Ulster County brownfields, and we're not going to collect that cost. Maybe we'll collect it over 30 years, right? So that people barely even feel it, so that the benefit will be enough to offset the cost. But privately owned utilities cannot make those type of decisions because their clock ticks against those quarterly earnings that they have to show to their investors. Finally, when you're a state authority, you're much better positioned to coordinate with other state entities. For example, we have NYSERDA, we have NYSO, we have ORIS, all these agencies that are working in the state planning of the state's energy. And if you're a state-owned corporation, you can be part of that conversation. So I mentioned this before, but we do not want to have a utility where we have given it all this authority, we have given it all these advantages, but we don't know what it's doing, right? So a good portion of our bill is for provisions that have to do with transparency and accountability and democracy for this new utility. The first thing that happens is that the way it's governed changes. So we get rid of Fortis, right? The state owns it, so the owner is different. We also get rid of Central Hudson's current board that is privately elected. The board is not responsible to us at all. They make their own decisions. We cannot go to their meetings and, make comments and so on. But we would replace it with the board of trustees that is much more democratic, and I'm going to show you the details in a bit. And instead of having the PSC defend the right of the investors to earn money as well as the right of the customer to have lower rates, we're going to have the oversight be done by this body called the Observatory, which is a civic society organization that oversees the board. And this is a model that is new and emerging, and it comes from the Paris Water Authority. So that's how they use it over there. So, for example, right now, the PSC only really gets involved when Central Hudson has already said we're going to increase rates. But we're talking about a community oversight body that is working with the board all year round and not just for, special occasions. And the PSC, though, is sort of a central piece in overseeing some things across the state. For example, how are the utilities doing towards our climate goals and so on. So we do want to have them have the authority to, oversee a few narrow things, but not the day-to-day rates and operations and so on. So that's going to happen through the observatory. So how will the Hudson Valley Power Authority be accountable? I mentioned year-round community oversight instead of through the PSC. And also remember, the PSC is overseeing every investor-owned utility in the state, so the 7 big ones, as well as, the smaller ones. So they are spread pretty thin, to be honest. So we are going to have our own dedicated community oversight body. The bill also requires the Board of Trustees to hold regular public meetings to discuss business, including rates and resource plans. So you don't have to wait for the rates to go up before you go to a public hearing. And you can also call special meetings if you can get 10% of the customers to sign a petition, or the observatory can call it, or the board can call it as well. The board is also required to hold semi-annual public assemblies, so these are larger events to encourage public participation. They will also be responsible for extensive public reporting requirements. A fun example, right now, people are trying to figure out how much Central Hudson does actually cost to acquire, and a lot of the information you would need is not even available to us. Because it's all, it's all held privately, and it's up to Central Hudson to decide if they want to share that information or not. That would not be the case for a publicly owned utility. Everything would be transparent. And we also made sure that these are mandates written into the statute, because we don't want all of these things to be happening based on the kindness and the goodwill of some of the people who might make it to the board. We want this to be guaranteed. Finally, when you don't have shareholders and a parent company like Fortis that you are responsible towards, there's only one party left that you're responsible towards, and that's the customers. So a utility is an anchor institution, right? It's not a business that can say, well, we're going to move elsewhere, right? It's forever anchored into our community. So we also think it should be a good employer and a source of good union jobs for the area. So we are very conscious of the fact that when we are talking about an inevitable energy transition, often the topic that takes a backseat is worker protections, labor standards, and so on. And we've seen this happen. Like, for example, when the NIPA bill that we passed, when it was first proposed by the governor, she had changed it to strip all of the labor language, and we had to fight to add it back. And when we did, it was actually the first time in the whole country that such strong labor standards were passed in a renewable sector. So we think the energy transition, thank you. We think that every bit of money we spend on building things should also be an opportunity to improve the lives of people who build those things. So that, for us, is not a nice to have, right? It's pretty central. So what do we do in this bill? First, Central Hudson's union is about 400 members. We think that actually that's pretty small because their workforce is over 1,000. So we would really like for the union to grow. Right now there are a lot of short-term contractors that are hired that the union has no say over. So we just want the union to have a little bit of say, because we know that even the union knows that short-term contractors are needed every now and then. But it should just not be a decision that only a few people have access to, right? The other thing that I mentioned, this additional authorization to generate energy. So we have included all of the strong language from the NIPA bill so that if Hudson Valley Power Authority decides to build energy, it is held to the same standard. And actually, that's the standard we're trying to move the entirety of the state's renewable sector towards as well, because in the private sector, it is basically non-existent. We also want to make sure that Central Hudson workers, because remember, when we do this acquisition, we're actually not changing the workers. It's only the ownership and the board. So we want to make sure that they don't lose their private sector status. So this is something you can do legally, and it came out of a task force recommendation on Long Island. But basically, you would keep just the workers at private sector so that they don't lose their right to strike, they don't lose their contract terms, they don't lose their pensions and retirement plans and so on. And we also want to make sure that whenever there is an opportunity to hire for new positions, that the priority pools are local workers and those that are going to be affected by energy transition. For example, a lot of gas workers have skills that are very transferable to geothermal. So if you're going to hire for geothermal, you should first look into the pool of people who might be at risk of losing their job because maybe a block is being phased out of a gas connection or something like that. We also give the union a seat in the board of trustees. I'm going to show you the chart in a bit, and 2 seats in the governing board of the oversight body. So that's the observatory, because we do think that the decision-making process should be as democratic and representative as possible. And right now, everything that workers need has to go through these rate increases. So if they need a new van, right, rate increase has to be approved. If they need an increase in their wages, rate increase has to be approved. So that has created this tension between the customers and the workers, because the customers are struggling with bills that are already too high, and the workers may need more wages because their cost of living has also gone up. So we really want to alleviate that tension by removing the dividends and the shareholders that are going to the shareholders and just making sure there's more money to play with for the workers' needs, for more modern equipment, for better working conditions, and so on. Finally, right now when Central Hudson contracts with third parties to build other things, for example, they built a training center in town of Ulster, they did not use any labor standard, right? But what we think that when they do those kind of contracts, they should be talking to unions that are in the area, because we have a lot of those unions that could have built it, that wanted to build that training center, but they were not hired. So we do have some requirements for that kind of contracting as well. This is the last section, so hold on, hang tight. So what does this transition actually look like, right? What needs to happen? So first, we need a big old state authorization. The bill that needs to pass, which we have introduced, authorizes lots of things. It authorizes the creation of the corporation. It gives them the rights and the responsibilities we want them to have. So it gives them the legal clearance to exist and do what we want them to do. So this bill has to pass in the Senate. It has to pass in the Assembly. and then it needs to be signed by the governor, which is how all bills pass, and this is also how the New York Power Authority was created. Also the Long Island Power Authority. So what happens after the bill is passed? First authorization is the corporation is created. It is allowed to exist with all its powers and responsibilities. Then we need to appoint members to the two boards that I'm going to show you next. Then there's going to be lawsuits and negotiations. This is just what has always happened, is going to happen. This is the utilities, this is where Fortis, this is their last chance to stop it. So this is where they're going to try to spend a lot of money and so on. But we have legal grounds to do it. It's been done before, the Constitution allows it, and so on. So it's just a little bump that we have to cross. And after we get that clearing, the corporation can start to issue bonds to raise its initial money. Then it's going to acquire Central Hudson. At this point, we really expect sort of an agreement that the two sides will come to, because if Fortis or Central Hudson does not negotiate, honestly, they will get a worse deal. So they will try to negotiate so that they come off a little bit better than they would if they don't, if they don't cooperate. Then we hand it off to the new board, the same workers, the new observatory to pick up the day-to-day operations. Now, this is a very big bill, so there's lots of things in the bill that I have not even mentioned. But one of them is, when these type of transitions happen, the utility that is being taken over is responsible for making sure that the day-to-day operations are not interrupted. So this has always happened successfully when these kind of public takeovers have happened in the past. So how much would it cost? So I mentioned before, Central Hudson does not want to give the public the information to really drill down on what exactly is their worth, what is happening under the hood, right? However, there are a few independent analyses floating around. One of them estimated just like a very quick math, maybe from 518 million to 1.19 billion based on the information that's available. There's another preliminary analysis that has happened that guesses maybe 3 billion. So what we expect to happen in the coming years is we expect there to be multiple deeper, longer analysis to come out, because there is a lot of interest in this legislation. So all that work is actually already happening. And even after we pass the bill, the final step needed is a PSC authorization, which is common, so don't be scared. The PSC does have to authorize anything energy related that's going to happen in the state, and they also have to do the final check on if the rates are actually going to lower. So there are, lots of safety guards. Okay. So the Board of Trustees, I did not send you this chart before because there's so much to take in here. But now that you are probably slightly fading, you can put some of your brain capacity to maybe being interested in the Board of Trustees. So we already have lots of public boards in many public corporations that exist. What is pretty common is for all of the appointments to be made by the governor. When that happens, the Senate has to confirm it, but honestly, that is not it's not a very democratic situation, generally speaking. So right now, the way we try to make board appointments more democratic is by giving the majority to legislative appointments, so the Senate or the Assembly. So then, in this case, we're talking about legislators who represent the Central Hudson Territory, facilitating the process of who gets appointed, and that tends to be much more democratic and open because we are working with the local preference. We're talking to local stakeholders to decide this. So there are a few appointments we already make, and when that happens, I will hear from people who live in my district. They will say, I want to apply to be on this board. Can you look at my resume? Can you write me a recommendation letter? So it already happens, but we're just making sure here that those 4 appointments are there, because that makes it more democratic and speaks for what is the sentiment on the ground. Then we give the union a seat. Right now they don't have a seat on the board. We gave them 1. Then there are 2 seats that are from the oversight body, because they need to be in day-to-day conversation with the board to make sure that they are working together. So what does this observatory look like? So we have 11 legislative appointments that need to reflect certain areas of expertise. So I know that's hard to read, so I'm going to read it out loud. Environmental justice, consumer protection, indigenous nation rights, community renewable energy, electrification, local government, energy efficiency. So the 11 people who are in that bucket, across them, those expert areas have to be represented. Then we have 2 legislative appointments from academic partners. Remember how I said we really want this utility to be cutting edge and embracing new technologies and so on? So in the Central Hudson Territory, we have at least 2 very good academic institutions who are already doing a lot of climate and energy related work. That's Bard College and SUNY New Paltz. And we have interest from both institutions to maybe have a representation on this board. That way you can think about, you have an additional research arm, but you can also think about how to incorporate things into curriculum and so on. Then we have 2 representatives from the union on the observatory as well, which makes them the party that has representation on both the decision-making side as well as the oversight side. Okay, so people want to know, sure, what exists? Tell me, right? How does it work already anywhere else? So one thing to note is that there is no other utility that is exactly like Central Hudson in terms of like size and geographical spread and so on that is publicly owned. So we don't have an exact, apple-to-apple comparison, but we do have plenty of other examples that should give us some confidence. So New York Power Authority is the country's largest publicly owned energy provider right here in our state. The second is Salt River Project in Arizona. And year after year, they are ranked first in residential customer satisfaction among all large electric utilities in the western U.S. And if you look at this data from 2022, compared to their privately owned competitor, they sold 2.3, let me get rid of that. They sold 2.3% more total electricity to retail customers that year, but collected 21% less revenue than their private counterparts. So this is another way of looking at how public utilities are already giving customers savings. I think now we're like at the end enough that I can just, and it does seem to be the screen and not the clicker. Okay, in the city of Austin, they've had a city-owned utility since 1895. So around this time is when I was saying there was really a municipal ownership model. And the model they use there, which is not what we're using, but they use the profits from this utility to fund part of the city's budget. Canada, right? We are so tired of talking about Canada. Not only do they get to have everything, they also have Fortis owning our energy utility. In the meantime, when they were waging this war between public ownership and private ownership, late 1800s and early 1900s, Canada mostly went with public ownership. So currently, most Canadian provinces and territories already have government-owned utilities that do the generation as well as the distribution. So, as usual, we're always made to feel bad about what's happening across the border. So that's the end of the presentation. If you want to volunteer, because this is going to be, I did not pick this fight because it's an easy fight. I picked this fight because it's a very hard fight. Okay, and the hardest fights are the ones that are worth picking. But it does mean we need a huge grassroots effort, so there's a way for everyone to get involved. Right now, what we're doing is if you email us, district103@nyassembly.gov, and say, hey, I want to volunteer, or if you tell our staff that at the table, the thing that's going to happen is you're going to be invited to a small training. A lot of them are led by me, usually like around 6 people or so. You will be trained on how to talk about this bill, because that is really the first thing to cross. Then, if you go to dinner parties, if you're talking to people, you can just talk about the bill, and you can get them signed up. You can also table at all of the events we're tabling at, and so on. So that's to volunteer. Finally, if you have not already, there is a petition that you can sign either through this QR code or through the paper that's going around. And we are trying to collect thousands and thousands of Central Hudson customers saying, yes, we support this, because if we cannot show the local support, nobody's going to want to support it, right? Your mayors, your town supervisors, your legislators, your Congress reps and so on, they need to know if the people that they are representing are asking them to support it or not. So that's the end of the presentation. Thank you. We're doing okay on time, so here's how it's going to work for the Q&A. Are you doing the list? Okay, so you're going to raise your hand if you want to ask a question. Kay is going to make a list. You're going to say your first name and where you're from, and then once the list is complete, we're going to be able to fit around probably 10 people. Then we will call on those people. If we don't get to you, that email I shared, let me put it back. This is where you can send in your question, but we're going to try to fit in as many people as possible. Raise your hand if you have a question. Kay is coming around. There's a hand over there. How many are we at? Okay, yeah, we can take like 3 more. And while we have this break, if you want to read a great book that just came out, it's called Democracy in Power. And we do have a copy, I believe, at the table. But it's a great read on the history of electrification in America and where the author thinks we should be headed next, which is public ownership. Good for us.